Hello, my name is Alejandro Lopez Contreras, and this recording is for my U.S. History 1301 class. I'll be arguing how religious pluralism affected the development of beliefs, attitudes, and politics of modern United States. This is a joint project with a previous essay I did on the Salem witch trials of 1692. The Salem witch trials of 1692 were a short, fast series of trials conducted in a Puritan Salem village in Massachusetts. The results of these trials were 54 confessions of witchcraft and 24 deaths from about more than 200 trials. The reason why these trials were so devastating was because there was no stable political system and there wasn't any peer review being applied on the trials. Therefore, the town consulted with pseudo-scientific books on witchcraft and the Puritan belief system. The accused in the trials had no options but to comply or die. If they complied, they gave the confessions that would reinforce Puritan belief. If they chose the latter, to deny their guilt and challenge the Puritan Church, they were either executed or imprisoned. In The Devil's Snare, a book by Mary Beth, she argues that Magistrate Hawthorne already assumed that the accused had committed the offenses in question, even before their hearings and trials. With all of these elements, it was easy to convict someone of witchcraft, because only superficial evidence and testimonies from questionable witnesses was necessary to declare an accused person guilty, regardless of their confessions. It was actually a weapon open to anyone who knew how to play with the proof. All of this evidence is supported by Mary Beth in her book In the Devil's Snare. And it is fair to argue that the Salem witch trials of 1692 served as a bloody socio-economic tool to reinforce Puritan belief and sift out religious skeptics. After the public heard the hearings of Mary Easty and Rebecca Nurse, they started to doubt the validation of the trials and of the Puritan Church conducting their trials by October. Later on, the use of specter evidence was banned, and that ended the trials by the next year of 1693. What is important to understand from these trials is that skepticism stopped them. The parishioners of Salem village started to doubt the education of ministers, the hierarchy of religious clergy, and the methods of their church. This actually repeats throughout all of the history of the United States, from its colonial beginnings to modern day. This pattern of theological revival or religious skepticism helped grow religious tolerance, which influenced congressional decisions like the First Amendment and the Civil Rights Act of 1964. The development of religious pluralism started at the colonial era of the United States, after the creation of the new Church of England. After the founding of the Anglican Church, persecution of any other denomination motivated Puritans, Separatists, Quakers, and amongst others to move to the New World. Evidence comes from two sources, from John Winthrop's message of City Upon a Hill to a letter sent to William Penn by the Assembly in England. While John Winthrop was on the Mayflower in 1630, he gave an inspiring speech with the name A City Upon a Hill. Here, John Winthrop states that he will open a different religion than that of the Anglican Church, but he curses himself if it upsets his God in the future. The Assembly of England sends a letter to William Penn, Act Concerning Religion, in 1649. And here, the Assembly is authorizing Penn to conduct his own religion. When Pennsylvania is allowed to exercise its own religion, it makes room for new theological ideas to grow, which also affects the religious pluralization of the United States. An important factor of the colonial era is the establishment of the Puritan Church in New England. This traditional dominance involved a uniform religion, which affected pluralism as well. For instance, Roger Williams was banned from Massachusetts for having different theological ideas, which later encouraged him to found Providence, Rhode Island in 1636. This island welcomed diversity in faith and helped religious pluralization. Another instance of the growing tolerance of diversity in the colonial era was when Thomas Hooker objected to the church membership being a requirement for voting in the Puritan community. So he founded Hartford, Connecticut in 1636. And that is why religious pluralism started in the United States in its colonial era in the first half of the 17th century. An imperative event that expanded religious pluralism in the United States, again, was the Salem witch trials of 1692. Besides what was already mentioned about the Salem witch trials, it is important to remember that it was the skepticism that ended the trials that promoted religious pluralism. And this set the stage for the Great Awakening of the second half of the 17th century. But once more, the trials dealt a heavy blow in the validation for the dominance of the Puritan Church in New England. Thanks to the American History Info Base, we are given evidence of religious pluralism in the United States in the Great Awakening, in which there's general agreement between historians that this Great Awakening happened between 1720s and 70s. It started with Jonathan Edwards when he disagreed with the Presbyterian churches in Northampton, Massachusetts. It caused him to preach that faith alone was the only connection with God. And this revival spread across the Connecticut River and landed in western Massachusetts and northern Connecticut. Later on, this would have influenced other key figures in the Great Awakening, like George Whitefield, giving his loud preaching in various parts of New England and the southern colonies and the middle colonies. Another key figure was John Wesley and Gilbert Tennant. Religious skeptics started to debate some topics on the Great Awakening. It was the place for emotion and reason in religion, if traditional religion was sustaining hierarchy and unequal treatment based on gender, race, and social position, and lastly, if college education for ministers limited the connection with God. The main friction was between New Lights, proto-evangelical believers, and Old Lights who opposed said revivals. This was great because radical supporters of the Great Awakening encouraged young men, women, and slaves to participate in religious activities, which was impossible with traditional religion, or Old Lights. In summary, the New Lights encouraged people to question the traditional church, and if they so desired, to open new churches under believed methods of worship. It is within my own speculation that the Great Awakening was part of the reason why the American Revolution, started. It is based on the evidence that after the Revolution, the Methodist Episcopal Church separated from the Anglican Church that was in the United States. And the evidence was taken from American History Info Base. After the Revolution, in 1787, September 17, the Constitution was being signed. With the religious pluralism that existed at that time, it helped to install religious toleration into the Constitution. The following is my evidence. Noah Feldman agrees in his article of God, Government, and You, where he says that if they wanted unity within the Constitution, they had to accept the diversity of religion that already existed in the United States. Further evidence lies on two other individuals that participated in the reframing of the Constitution. In the Virginia Statute, Thomas Jefferson advocates for religious freedom. Stephen J. Heyman, in The Light of Nature, John Locke, Natural Rights and the Origins of American Religious Liberty. He explains that John Locke's theory of religious liberty deeply influenced the adoption of the First Amendment and the first state Bills of Rights. But religious polarization went further beyond the American Revolution and the framing of the Constitution. It reached the Civil War. This time, the topic of slavery was the one that influenced people to be skeptic about the traditional church. One source of proof comes from a diary entry from Domini Sumner Lunt, a widow woman who owned slaves, that during the Civil War she made the following entry of November 8, 1864, in which she questioned whether slavery was a sin or not. John Carlson and Jonathan Ebel in John Brown, Jeremiah, and Jihad, Reflections on Religious Violence in America, proved that John Brown justified his actions with his opposition of slavery being sinless within the traditional church. This attitude of toleration to the diversity of religion influenced all type of diversity. Not only that, skepticism reached beyond religion and influenced civil rights. Women started to demand equal rights and education through reform movements in the 19th and 20th century. A prime example of this with skepticism was Elizabeth Cady Stanton on her speech on women's rights in 1848. Here, she dared that the role of women surpassed a suppressive church and government. That, with other reform movements, like the one advocating for equality for African Americans, motivated the penalization of discrimination of color, gender, sex, race, and religion in the Civil Rights Act of 1964. The theme that repeats here is the achievement of individual freedom through skepticism. Throughout history, the United States being an example, skepticism of traditional religion, government, and scientific laws created greater freedom through an increasing tolerance to diversity. This theme resembles today's society because, by merely existing, the individual is in constant spiritual and intellectual warfare between one's reality and fantastical ideals. Indeed, in every spiritual revolution that was previously mentioned, every believer was fighting for their ideas, for there existed a realm that differed from their values, that formed part of their identity. But behind all the bloody warfare, skeptic revivals, and reform movements lies a common ground where most of us could agree on, one where stands in the middle between objective reality and subjective fantasy. A super idea that surprisingly survives in the limbo of uncertainty, and that is freedom of choice.